Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gostola, and welcome to this conversation. I'm very pleased to be joined by, we'll start with Lara Witt, who is the editor in chief of Prism, an independent and nonprofit news outlet led by journalists of color, and the co founder of the Movement Media Alliance. And then also with Lara is Maya Schenwar, who's the Truthout editor at large, a director of Truthout Center for Grassroots Journalism, an author. Her latest book is We Grow the World Together, Parenting Toward Abolition, a book co-edited with Kim Wilson. I'm obligated to mention it because my former colleague Brian Sonnenstein used to work with her all the time and still does, I believe, collaborate. But welcome. It's good to see you both.
Thank you. It's good to see you too.
Thanks, Kevin. Hi.
And yeah, this Movement Media Alliance is why I invited both of you on to discuss. I think it's an essential and necessary thing for journalists out there, especially people who hold themselves out as grassroots or grassroots independent journalists, that they should be considering this kind of media solidarity building and also collaboration. I'll say right now very openly that I feel incredibly isolated as I do this work quite and it's a little bit difficult to figure out where to uh, insert yourself. I mean, it feels like you might be imposing yourself sometimes if you push too hard for certain collaboration, because everybody has their own news beats. People have their own focus that they like, the issues that they wish to cover, and then some people aren't even really interested in movement building. Some of them are just out to uh, I think they're taking more of a path where they're just building up their influence and their channels, and just are looking for some kind of celebrity status, for lack of a better way of describing it all. And so as we get into this, the Movement Media Alliance you describe as a coalition of grassroots aligned, social justice driven journalism organizations committed to accurate, transparent, accountable, principled, and just media. Now, before we get into the genesis of this project, I feel like it's probably a good thing to just lay out there what your view is of movement journalism before we get too far into this discussion, because it is evident to me that there are establishment media organizations that throw around this term independent journalism and purport to be engaged. The New York Times believes that they're engaged in independent journalism, and they ask
Right.
people to support their paper even though they have shares of their company on the stock market. So I always feel
Yeah.
like that is a perversion of it. So, I mean, Maya, Laura, you both can take this, but what's your idea of movement journalism?
I can say first of all, I totally agree with you about this shift in mainstream media toward identifying as independent and how that has impacted those of us actually doing journalism that's much more independent from corporate and political influence. And I saw this shift really prominently during the first Trump administration when the Washington Post was like, we're changing our tagline to democracy dies in darkness. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, you're the darkness. But, and then with the New York Times kind of shifting actually quite a bit rightward, and
Mhm.
it was always maintaining the status quo, but in recent years they're very emphatically anti-trans coverage, they're kind of open Zionism, all of these things we see, and the word independent starts to become a little bit, I don't want to say meaningless because I hate kind of surrendering our words to the center and the right. But I think a lot of us have been grasping for how to define ourselves when we're doing journalism that actually has a goal of liberation. And I think that Press On and other organizations have been talking about this idea of media in the service of liberation, media that centers justice as a value openly, as opposed to thinking, oh, we have to represent two sides of everything, with one side being justice and uh, liberation or freedom or however you're defining it, and the other side being fascism. And it's like, oh, let's uplift these equally. So I think that recognizing that distinction in our journalism, that not only are we working without corporate sponsors, and not only are we not aligned with political parties, but we're actually movement aligned. We actually believe that we're doing this in order to further goals of liberation and justice, not saying we're propaganda arms or that we're publishing press releases from activist groups, but that we are part of those movements, that we are doing work, we're doing investigations, we're doing analyses that are hopefully fueling a better future.
It's also so much about including the voices that have been either deplatformed, censored, or pushed out of larger media narratives and newsrooms too. Since the 2014 uprisings and then continued uprisings every few years, there was this big shift within newsrooms for more diversity and inclusion within them, but in like title only, just in like bodies only, not really in ethos, not in like change of editorial standards, not in ensuring that they were correcting um, a lot of the oppressions that they continued to fuel through like really white supremacist propaganda. Uh, and now we've seen in like the last year or so, just a lot of these Black and brown journalists are getting pushed out. They're not getting rehired after their contracts end. They're being fired for signing letters or just pushed out for signing letters in solidarity with Palestine and Palestinian writers and authors and journalists in the US. And I feel like we know that movement journalism is the antidote to a lot of that. And when these large traditional journalistic entities try to paint themselves as independent, the only thing that they're really independent from is accountability from with their actual readers and the public that has been harmed by them.
Yeah, exactly. Because the New York Times did away with their public editor. And so now there's nobody you can turn to as readers if you're, upset that they, to use the example of Gaza, push a bunch of propaganda about sexual violence on October 7th that never actually transpired.
Yep.
And has clear racist undertones as for why they're promoting that in their newspaper. You've touched on a few of the challenges, and we'll get to them as we go through the conversation. I make sure as I share this with people who are listening that there's a link to the fantastic op-ed that you put together, just laying out the launch and what this is all about movement media organizations coming together to build power, and what that could look like. The genesis, getting together, the inspiration for coming together is probably generally clear as we speak here today, but also you can be specific about the moment and why you sat down and you were at the Haymarket House in Chicago, it seems like, and coming up with a plan for, or just, brainstorming about how media could support each other.
Yeah, absolutely. So our initial convening came out of some conversations that a few of us were having over the summer in 2023. Me, Alex Hahn from In These Times, Kaden Mock from Convergence, and some folks from the Real News Network. And we initially were talking about the 2024 election and just our feelings of an inability to cover it alone. Not just in terms of editorial staff or capacity, but also in terms of just working through an analysis and an approach in a really fraught time. And so that was one impetus. And another one was just a sense that, as you said, Kevin, at the beginning, we just weren't talking to each other. And there was something that we lost with the sunset of the Media Consortium in 2018. And the Media Consortium was this large network of organizations, media organizations that identified as independent media and toward the end identified as movement media or social justice journalism, and came together sometimes around the word progressive. And all of these organizations would get together for a conference once a year, would have some loose communication. And when that organization went through its sunset, it wasn't clear, like, what are the next steps for us connecting with each other? But also, even during that time, coming together for a conference or engaging in specific collaborations didn't feel like enough. And I know that I was feeling a year ago this sense of not only having lost a type of media association with like minded peers, but also just a sense of feeling siloed. Like we're each operating in these competitive bubbles, even as we're talking about hating capitalism and how our publications are pushing back against this ethos of competition. Meanwhile, we're like competing with each other, competing with other movement media organizations, and also just feeling a sense of, well, what would it take to reach out? Do we have to have some specific collaboration proposal? And then how do you make that happen? So the idea was, okay, we're going to have this conversation around a table. It will not be a conference. It'll be a convening of some folks from various movement media organizations. And we'll just talk to each other and we'll see what comes out of it. And we did. And it was a revelation in itself just to be connecting with each other and putting faces to names and thinking through, each of us are running these organizations that are almost by definition precarious, because if we don't have this vast corporate backing, like what do we have? Either foundations or this grassroots reader support that we're constantly needing to drum up. So we talked about capacity building. We talked about how we come to our editorial positions. Particularly in the fall, we talked about covering Palestine and how we were going to potentially support each other in doing that in a very repressive time. And so things got rolling from there. And in June we came together around other things for our second convening, but we can talk more about that in a moment.
Well, maybe Lara, as you answer my question, you can get into this idea of having editorial collaborations be something that these organizations unite around, and in particular that media against apartheid and displacement, which I know you're a leading, and you're involved in that in a very big capacity.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Media Against Apartheid and Displacement was a brainchild that just came about during a walk after October 7th, when I think so many of us in media were like, how do we push back narratively? How do we stage like a narrative intervention on Zionist narratives? especially since the US is so primed to absorb them because of just decades of brainwashing with no context of the Nakba or settler colonialism and, educational efforts to censor and push back on settler colonialism in general, any knowledge of it. So not only did we have to, one, do reporting that was responsible and that centered Palestinian voices, Palestinian American voices, but we also had to do like a lot of political education and contextual, education and historical education for folks who were coming into this maybe new. They may like understand that there was something wrong in U.S. media coverage, but they couldn't point it out. They couldn't see a lot of the elements of like manufacturing consent for a genocide. And so it was our responsibility to be able to like point people in the direction of media that they could rely on, media that they could make and informed decisions upon, things that they could use to inform themselves and develop their politic and ground it in something really solid and accurate. And since so many of our outlets already do such excellent work around Palestine or learning to in the moment, we wanted to be able to provide readers with like a centralized hub, and that's how Media Against Apartheid came about. So we discussed it during our first convening in November about how we could collaborate together to give people the information necessary. And rather than like siphon clicks away from our individual websites, Media Against Apartheid and Displacement is a hub, and it redirects to our sites so that people can learn more about each outlet that participates in this. It did also mean that a lot of organizations and publications themselves had to sign on to a mission statement that was explicitly anti-settler colonial, that was against the genocide, which at the time a lot of outlets were, not ours, but many outlets were scared to do so because if they are nonprofits and they rely on funding, they didn't want funders pulling their funding. They didn't know which funders they could rely on and who they could talk to about what they were doing. And we understand this in this moment now, how crucial it is for us to support each other. And so the greater number of outlets that could sign on to this, the more people on the external side of things could see like, oh, there's actually a coalition of media makers who understand their role in this, and we can't really fuck with them.
It just seems like so much that ails grassroots social justice driven media is just like the fact that everyone seems to be trying to do it in their own way, and it's very difficult to figure out what direction to take. And so it would be a better thing to be communicating with other organizations, and then to be able to pool, I'm being kind of vague, but to be able to pool your experiences and then say, okay, well, we already tried that. That's not going to solve this problem. So you might want to skip that and then maybe try this other idea, which actually sounds interesting. I hadn't thought about that thing before. I do want to say I spoke about the Haymarket House. Like everyone who listens to this show will know what that is, but unless you're in Chicago, you probably wouldn't know what that meant. And that's the Haymarket Books house that they have. So that's what that means. So just to get into some more of the like specifics in the launch op-ed, I was drawn to the fact that part of it pays attention to the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation among the press. And this vague term that we see thrown around now, as you really eloquently described it, of independent journalism. Maya, independent journalists are guilty of spreading this misinformation and disinformation as well, to a great extent, sometimes perhaps as equally as the people who are working at these corporate or legacy media organizations. So how do you view disinformation and misinformation? Is it different to you than what like if someone publishes a column at the New York Times about disinformation and misinformation, we may not actually see what they're claiming is disinformation. We might believe that like actually no, you're choosing not to believe the truth or the reality of a particular issue. It might involve trans people. It could involve the war on Gaza. But then maybe both of you in fielding that can talk about how crucial it is to weigh in on misinformation and disinformation given its impact on oppressed communities.
There's a basic level of fact checking that everything needs to go through. A lot of misinformation and disinformation from traditional media outlets will proliferate because the fact checking is relying on sources that are either state approved, and in many cases, and if we're going to be specific about Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories, then the Israeli military itself. The New York Times will often, like they just did last night, after a bombing of a safe space or a safe place and refuge, which were tents, and just evaporated families and over 40 people, we think at the time. The New York Times itself is one continues to launder whatever the Israeli military will give them, or just preemptively do so, even if the Israeli military admits to bombing a place. And so they themselves will spread misinformation and disinformation. And you mentioned this earlier in their reporting on sexual assault, and false claims of it. That itself is in misinformation and disinformation in its purest form, because since then, and even before, as it started to ramp up, many movement journalists and outlets, including Electronic Intifada, were pushing back on this and saying, like, this is exactly what they do. They will claim that this thing happened. US outlets will run with it and state that the Israeli military said this to them, reported it, and they just report it as fact just because the Israeli military said so. And if journalists push back and they say, like, well, what proof do you have from that? They're like, well, we'll get back to you later. We'll just TBD on that one. We're waiting for the Israeli military to investigate themselves. And so this allows for readers to simply take what the US media is saying at face value and then spiral it out of control into this gigantic and almost overwhelming amount of Islamophobic, anti-Palestinian propaganda. And that happened immediately after October 7th. And so that was what we had to push back against, was this level of misinformation and disinformation that was willful and that was incredibly intentional. So yeah, that's how we're looking at misinformation and disinformation. It happens in traditional media spaces every single day in order to justify the US's crimes.
And I think about this also in connection with reporting around the prison industrial complex. So I went through a little phase in my life, like 2013, 2014, and 15, where I wrote a few op-eds for the New York Times because I had this idea of kind of like pushing this idea of abolition out into the mainstream. And the New York Times would never have published those op-eds now, like current day New York Times. But they were kind of like tossing around this idea of occasionally publishing something really disruptive, and then people would get mad. And but one thing I found really interesting and disturbing about their fact checking process, which I think now they have a lot less fact checking than they did back then, but a lot of their fact checking process involved asking for state documents to back up what I was presenting around state violence. So asking for prison records and confirmation from court documents of things that incarcerated people were saying and claiming, and how can you back up every single thing that a person inside has said? And this is obviously ridiculous if you're trying to expose wrongdoing by the state, but it's such a long tradition in legacy media of reporting exactly what the police have said as fact, and sometimes even having stories that are just the police, police as the sole source, or police and state officials as the sole sources, and that being presented as fact. And I think that that's something that we need to constantly be challenging at every turn. And in terms of independent media also spreading misinformation, absolutely. I think that having been at Truthout for 17 years, I have seen every brand of conspiracy theorist on the left kind of pushing their ideas, and a lot of them are completely ridiculous. Some of them are echoing right wing talking points just in different and skewed ways. And I think that's also something that we have to grapple with, that just because something or some media organization talks about itself as movement aligned doesn't mean that it's necessarily prioritizing accuracy, accountability, transparency. So that's something that we definitely wrestle with is, okay, you know, we want to be working with media on the left, and we still want to be prioritizing accuracy. We don't want to become propaganda arms of one movement or another without doing that work as journalists as well.
Yeah, but I think why it's important for you to articulate it in that manner is because this grouping of journalists, especially if they hold themselves out as left media, the problem that they have is that they're not grounded in any movement, so they don't seem to have any grasp of what's happening in these movements, even if they're going to say they're sympathetic. And so what you have is just this very jaded, cynical, which I understand, alienated response and take on everything that usually they're only focused on the US government. If they talk about anything
Right.
local, you'd be fortunate to hear them because that's not where the clicks are. They need to dig deep into the like national news stories and
Yes.
have their own contrarian viewpoint. But yeah, like I think the main reason why we could call that junk is because there's nothing to ground their anger.
Mhm.
There's no solution, there's no antidote to it. Well, okay, yes, you're fed up with this and you've came up with this theory for why the government is doing these certain things, but what about the people who are out there challenging it every single day and trying to make the world better? And they're usually completely absent. You wouldn't know that they were out there. It's as if there's a vacuum. Anyways, that's just me spouting off.
No, totally.
But
I
go ahead.
like on that note, I think that's really important, and something that unites us is actually keeping in mind this aspect of our work that isn't just about exposing injustice or exposing the other side, like kind of what mainstream media is doing wrong or investigated issues they're not investigating. It's about answering this question of what are we growing,
Yeah.
and uplifting the work of organizers, and uplifting also projects that people are creating that are building the world we want.
Yeah. It's like they zig we zag tactic, which like if these reporters are not doing their due diligence and talking to the people who have been doing this work for years and who have the experiences necessary to really inform the reporting, what are you doing? Like, what is the value of that reporting? What's the editorial standard? What are you offering to readers for them to act on? There's nothing there. Like, if you're informing them with the things that you have to say, you also have to back it up with the people who are experiencing these things, that feel the impacts of a policy, that feel the impacts of an oppression. Um, it includes movement journalism, includes so much community. Like, it has to be community centered. It requires a lot of accountability amongst each other, with each other. Like, a lot of what the MMA can offer and already has offered to each other is be able to, one, fill the gaps where some of us may be lacking. But it also means that if we don't know very much about a thing, that we can ask someone that we are working with within the MMA, like, I don't know this, can you please help me? And that sort of vulnerability is actually such a strength.
All right, so let me ask you about, and maybe you want to speak on this first, Laura. Communities beyond elections, having that be a thing. I'll tell you, as somebody who had the opportunity to try and run a media organization for 7 years or so, and knows about the difficulties, that one of the things that I took a
You
look at.
did run a media just putting out there, you ran
Okay,
a
okay,
really
all right,
amazing
we
media.
did, we did. But one of the things that I think we basically punted on because it was such a headache was to just say, nah, we're not interested in electoral politics. We're not going to cover it on this website. We'll just do issues based journalism. And what we mean is then, there's never anything about the horse races. It doesn't matter whether the Democrat running for president or the Republican running for president is, this or that. We don't really have to dig into it. We'll just let it sort itself out in November. And this was more of like a national presidential politics thing. I suppose on the local levels, there were a potential that we might engage in something. But usually when people think of electoral politics, they think of the way we are completely inundated for like 3 or 4 years with this electoralism around presidential politics. And so I just figured, let's ignore it. But, if it's communities beyond elections, like the way I understand this with movement media is, maybe there might be, as I digest this, I think maybe there might be a reason why certain communities would want to engage in the morally bankrupt discussions that are being had in the press.
Oh, for sure. One, because we can't help it and it's kind of fun in like this like icky sort of way to engage in it. And two, because it's important to push back on the narratives that are being pushed by either presidential candidates, their VPs, and everybody else within their parties. And it's incredibly important for us to pay attention in order to inform the pieces that are around all of it. So if you're not maybe reporting on the horse racy shit, the impact of the horse racy shit and the obfuscation and the distraction of political theater is important for us to understand before we report on everything else. So they coexist. They have to be at least looked at side by side and as things that feed each other. But Communities Beyond Elections is an upcoming project that we're putting together that looks at the people impacted by policies, looks at the people who are impacted by either the, not having rights to vote because they're undocumented, but they still participate in the system in different ways. Looks at the impact of policies on sex workers, on BIPOC, on trans folks, but also pushes people to think of, the electoral system beyond just voting that one time. So many Americans think that just going to the ballot box once a year or every 2 years is pretty much the extent of their participation in American political society. But everything around us is political. There's no such thing as being apolitical. Like, you are within a political system. Everything that has led you to this moment is based off of what people believed you had a right to access to, whether they believe you have a right to housing, to water, to exist without surveillance, to exist freely outside and beyond bars. So we have to tie all those things together, but also draw attention to the folks that are left out of, again, that are left out of most media narratives, which means the people who are not uplifted by traditional media. And so that's what Communities Beyond Elections is going to seek to do, is we're starting it off with this election cycle and continuing that coverage because everything is political.
And then let me just throw it out because I have had the opportunity to experience it myself over the last year and think about what it will be like to be a parent who is also a journalist. Or I suppose I'm inverting it improperly. It should be a journalist who is a parent, because this type of work where you're struggling and it's not paying. I think it's really tempting, and you do allude to this in your launch op-ed, that like you could look at all of these challenges out there and just give up. You could walk away and decide that like it's not worth investing my time and energy to try and unravel this. Of course, I'm sure in your conversations you talked about what would be lost if people gave up. What are some of the discussions you're having? And I suppose I address this to Maya, being that you've written a book about parenting and are a parent. That to that talking about this, and then I suppose I recognize, I'll let you answer, but I do want to, for the people out there who aren't parents, recognize that some of these things that I believe parents are dealing with are like, well, those are the things that anyone's been dealing with that had 2 or 3 jobs that they had to attend to and also put out their own journalism.
Yeah, totally. So the question is about what would be lost if we let this stuff
Well, no,
die.
I did
Yeah.
I ran away from my initial question, which I think is really what I'm intrigued about is, when we talk about movement journalism and where someone would fit, um, who is a parent who is looking at this and going, well, this is really difficult. Like, I think I'm going to have to find something else and come
Mm,
back when it is less consumed. Well, here, I'll lay this out here. I'll lay this out here as my example because I think that this is a universal example. Especially when you've got a shithead out there like JD Vance talking about childcare in a way that made my wife actually
ooh,
furious, just so
yeah,
furious,
it's
just about like
horrifying.
how like his thing was like, why don't you just go ask your grandparents to come help? And I was like, yeah, yeah, sure. Like, it would be just so
My
simple to just
God.
have the grandparents come over every single day. Like
Oh,
like they have the capability to do that at 71 or 72, crawl around the floor and chase your kid. Okay, whatever. Um,
right.
so I think because of the cost of childcare, you face a choice in this country. You face a choice of whether you're going to provide the care yourself and take the hit financially to your household. Now, if you're single, I think it's even worse thing. But I'm talking about, let's say you can share it with a couple. You choose to provide the care yourself so that you don't have to spend that money, but then that means you can't take on the second job. That would be, so you're relying on one adult with one decently paying job, hopefully. But it might work. But what wouldn't work is if you had to pay 30,000 or $25,000 a year on childcare, and then the job that you were working actually made less than what childcare costs. So then you were actually running up debt trying to pay for it. So you might decide that you don't want to do journalism anymore if you were a journalist who became a parent. And I would ask you, where does movement journalism come in when you face that
Oh
dilemma?
my gosh. Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it does apply more broadly too, because it's like people get to this point in their lives very often where they're like, "Oh shit, I don't want to live paycheck to paycheck, or I don't want to live in such precarity." And you add in a child, and then you think, well, I am not just failing myself, like, I'm not just not able to buy a new shirt today. It's like I need to actually feed my baby. So yeah, I get it. And it's like you can have all of these incredible ideals and talk about building this thing for the future, but you also have to have this reliable income for the present and also a sense of job security that historically has been pretty much non-existent in independent slash movement journalism, and now of course the entire field of journalism is like, what's job security? And that's actually one of the things that brought us together in Movement Media Alliance. Like, when we really dug into why do we want to talk to each other, one of the reasons was because everyone was scared of their publication dying. Everyone was scared of layoffs. Nobody had enough benefits. The benefits that we had were often around like things that you can do without money or with very little money, as opposed to having really, really great health insurance, which of course is more important if you do have a child. All of these things that are like fundamental to living a life in which you're not constantly panicking. And I think these are questions that are easier to talk about together. So, one of the things that we've talked about with Movement Media Alliance and thinking about growing into the future with more publications is how could we have a health insurance pool where we're able to get better health insurance if we're all going in together? How could we potentially support each other in having more services around security, like tech security, so that we don't feel so at risk in the universe of the internet? All of these things that help you breathe out a little bit and fundraise together down the line so that we're able to provide for our staff better. And I think that none of these questions are easy to answer, but it helps to have more brains in the mix. And I think also some of the questions, at least for me, that I face as a parent are um, not only about the immediate security thing, but also about the future, about how do you pay for college? Like how do
Yeah.
you how do you face the fact that climate change is coming? And in addition to thinking about it on the personal level, that's what we're reporting on. Those are the things that we're covering as movement journalists. And if we really believe in this field, we're hoping that our work is going to help us get those things, you know, that organizing gets the goods and media is part of organizing. So yeah, but it is a struggle. Like
Mm.
all of these things that we're saying, they sound good and are good, but one of the reasons that we're talking to each other is because they're also incredibly difficult and like there is no perfect answer.
Mm. And we have to fundraise in a landscape where we have to convince people that funding movement journalism is an essential component to ensuring like a just society. Because a lot of folks want to, and rightfully so, want to invest and fund like direct services and see journalism more as like a perk. But it's such an essential component to be able to do everything else that we want to do because we inform people. And journalists and movement journalists and the people who participate in movement journalism are usually from marginalized backgrounds. We don't come from families with a lot of money. Journalism usually has all these hurdles in place, which means that like usually white folks from like wealthier backgrounds are okay with living in New York off of 60 or 70K a year because they have a trust fund or they have parents who continue to support them or their home was like purchased by their parents. Most of us don't have that. And so, what we want to create is the infrastructure that allows for more people like us from marginalized backgrounds have access to journalism and see this as a viable career.
And also imagine you might have had conversations about social justice driven platforms being essential. And now that's even more of a titanic thing to tackle than just focusing on what you can do for each other's organizations, but something that was also very uh I'll say it made me feel pretty jaded about journalism for the first time in the decade plus that I've been doing this work because Elon Musk goes and buys Twitter, okay, and then destroys it, proceeds to destroy it. And if your conspiracy is that that was the goal so that movements wouldn't have the ability to use it the way that they had, going all the way back to like, wow, I saw it at its highest potential with Occupy Wall Street. Like, that's how long that I know Twitter had a potential impact to make it so that you could reach other people. I used it as a very key way to push out journalism that was being produced. So did numerous organizations, and that has been lost. That has been completely destroyed. And I think there's probably a lot of organizations scrambling, but then dealing with that fracturedness because like there were alternatives that came up, but there were like a half dozen alternatives. Which one are you supposed to go to? And when you have such limited time, you can't have a presence on 12 different platforms. Nobody can maintain that for their organization. It's insanity.
I think that acknowledging what was lost with Twitter is important, even though it was never perfect.
Mm.
It was I think at its height, it was a tremendous vehicle for both movements and for journalism outside of the mainstream and outside of these high circulation platforms that could do it without Twitter. And I think that you're right that these subsequent 20 options, they're never going to be the same thing, you know. But something that is inspiring to me, a couple things are one, people like you who have said, okay, I'm going to actually have my newsletter that I can create and that I can push out to a lot of people, some of whom I've kind of brought in through those Twitter days, through those the, the heyday when we all thought we could talk to each other in this particular way. And then people have created platforms that I think are in some ways even more unmitigated because
Mhm.
you're able to talk directly to your readers. And I think that's pretty cool. I also think that some of these movement media organizations are picking up where Twitter left off and not in the same way. Like, it's less of a conversation. But people who used to have really huge platforms on Twitter are writing for a number of these movement media organizations and getting their thoughts out on a much wider scale in some cases. And I also think that for me, I was always very stressed out by Twitter. And I also recognize its value all the time, like it's a constant battle in my head. And I think that one thing that we potentially gain by focusing on movement media, by focusing on places where we can actually be fact checking and trying to do this transparent reporting and doing editing and things like that, is there is a potential to prioritize truth in a way that can't happen on any social media platform, I don't think. So, I don't know. But again, RIP. It we did lose something there.
We did, but like Twitter was really useful when I was first starting off my journalism career because it was at the height of when like places like Teen Vogue and like more like women centered magazines were like we a bunch of black folks have gotten killed by police and now we need like BIPOC journalists to cover it, but we don't want to hire any. We're just going to have you be freelancers. And so that's how I got started, was like they wanted to do like identity based journalism and they wanted to talk to like black and brown reporters. um, and so like I used to write for Teen Vogue for like I think it was like $300 a piece, which like isn't much at all. But it was a good start. But it also made folks like myself, and myself included, targets for white supremacist hate. I got doxxed because of Twitter. I had to wipe like my entire identity off of the internet, my address. I had to make sure that everything was locked down. It's a good thing I ended up moving like 2 months later because they had access to all of that. My information was on Stormfront. Like Twitter had its benefits, but it also made black and brown people incredibly susceptible to surveillance, to violence, and there was no protection for us. The places that we were writing for didn't offer us protection. Teen Vogue didn't do shit. Like the solidarity that I had to build was like me going to people who had more experience than me in media to be like, can you help me? Is there like, what do I do? This has never happened to me before. Um, so yes, it was fun. It was a little bit lawless and like interesting. And I met a lot of people through it. But I would say that the spaces that we're creating now actually foster stronger bonds of solidarity, more accountability for each other. And like I'm sorry, but I love a tried and true newsletter. Like I will consume that with
Love it.
you know,
Yes.
it's such a delicious, well curated thing.
Yeah.
And I appreciate going back to things that like are just yeah, are classics.
Well, that was being lost before Elon ever
Yes.
stepped forward with this crazy idea to, well, it's not a crazy idea. I mean, it's very classic that he would want to, as a billionaire, control it. I mean, it's, William Randolph Hearst wanted to have his stranglehold over journalism in the 1900s. So it's classic robber baron behavior to want to own these social media platforms. But I'll leave with 2 points and then let both of you provide any final thoughts about the Movement Media Alliance and or tell people about how to support it, which I think is really crucial in this moment. I mean, first, I'm struck over the last months, particularly with the genocidal violence by the Israeli government with the support of the US, that there are something around 150 plus journalists or 170 journalists that have been killed in Gaza. And it's just like not, I do a lot of work around freedom of the press. There's just not this constant drumbeat of when is this going to stop? Where is this going to stop? Nobody speaks up for that massive number of people. So I think about movement media journalism in that context and bringing support to people who the legacy press and the corporate press aren't ever going to support. Like the journalists that got arrested during the DNC were ignored most universally by the legacy press, even though it was horrific that they were losing a night of work because of being jailed. But then, you know, this isn't anything that anybody can answer, but I just want to put this out there as a question. Because a lot of questions have been raised in this conversation. Hope people will spend some time chewing over these issues that you're trying to resolve. And that is how you value somebody. Because what you were saying about working as a freelancer and Teen Vogue, it's exploitative, but the Teen Vogue would say that, and probably it's a lie, that they don't have money to give. And I think because of the amount of content that they want to publish, that's why they don't have the money, because they're trying to be a content mill rather than just put out quality journalism. And so I would just raise the issue of how you value somebody, because these are like all of us are involved in organizations that have shoestring budgets, and it's really difficult to operate them. And sometimes I feel like I'm offering somebody like if I go to them, I want to hire them. I might be insulting them with how little money I have to offer, but also I want to be able to work with them and engage with them and promote their work. And you feel sort of like, hmm, is this going to be valuable to the other person who is being hired? Because you recognize that there are other outlets that they can turn to that might have more money, but you also don't think that those other institutions have the same values that are good for like social justice movement building.
It's a choice we have to make, right? Like if when outlets would approach me and there were more values aligned with me and they couldn't offer as much as a more traditional media outlet, that was fine. I understood that the thing that I was saying was going to go further with the readers that they have. It was going to make a greater impact. It wasn't going to be like hate clicks. It was going to be like, oh, I'm absorbing this and I'm going to apply this to my life. This is going to shift things and change things. There's a lot of value in that. Like I would take, $50 from Everyday Feminism, which like was almost nothing, but like I would rather work for them on a regular basis because their editors were lovely. They were super supportive. They provided like a lot of editorial guidance, whereas, larger places, their editors barely have any time. They don't help you with like honing your pitch and honing your craft. They're just there, as you put it, as a content mill. Like Prism we don't have as much money, but like we offer like a fairly decent rate of like 50 to 60 cents per word. And we want to be able to increase that. But we also offer each of our freelance writers a lot of guidance and support and mentorship so that they can take their clips, take their pitches elsewhere, and get paid more as they continue in their careers.
Absolutely. That's really well put. And I think also we have to recognize Teen Vogue, owned by Condé Nast, actually could be paying more
Yeah.
per
Yes.
article. And why are they paying the same amount as some of our movement media organizations? Clearly, they're paying someone at the top so much more than our people are getting paid at the top, right? And so looking at that, I know, and I don't know how much the New York Times is offering for op-eds now, but they used to pay people $150 per op-ed, and they would say, yeah, but it's the honor of being published in the New York Times is really why you're doing it, And so I think that fundamentally, obviously, all of us in movement journalism have work to do in terms of raising money to pay people more, but also we can look at these corporate media organizations with a more critical eye, depending on how this money is being distributed throughout their organizations and what the goals are with that.
So is there a place people should go to help you? Is there like you're taking donations and then you're gonna like make sure that this movement media building can continue?
Yes. So we have our website, movement/media.org. We will be setting up a donate or a donation button. There is an email address there that people can contact, and those emails go directly to Maya, myself, Kaden, Alex, and Deshawn, the network coordinators. So, if funders want to reach out to us, you're more than welcome to. We are talking through like what governance and structure and et cetera what are going to look like as we continue building this out, and so we'll have like more information to share as things come about and like just become more like official. So yeah, more to come.
All right, it's exciting. Thank you for talking.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Kevin.